Well, good morning to you all at Hexham Methodist Church. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person, but it's good to be celebrating harvest all the same. And today, as we unpick that scripture, as we hear a little bit more about what John 6 has to say for us today and that miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, we'll be exploring how the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Like this ordinary bicycle. This one spends far too much time in the shed. It doesn't get that much use. But in Uganda, these ordinary everyday items, these perhaps even luxury items that many of us disregard, they become extraordinary. And I wonder if that can apply to us today too. So if you're feeling ordinary, let's unpack John 6 together. So, what is it that John 6 has to say to us? Well, I think we begin by exploring this miraculous moment from the point of view of Philip. Because I think the first thing for us to pick up on today is the counter-narrative that exists here in this gospel passage between Jesus on one hand and Philip on the other. Philip, in so many ways, represents so many of us, doesn't he? Logical Philip, spreadsheet Philip, flip chart, clipboard Philip. He's thought it all through, he's got a plan, and he's got a good, quick, analytical brain, hasn't he? Because in the middle of that reading we just heard from John chapter 6, in this setting, there's thousands of people, they all need feeding, and in that moment, Jesus turns to Philip and says, what are we going to do? How are we going to feed all these people? Suddenly, this passage isn't about ministry and what it might be that Jesus was sharing with them. This is perhaps a classic harvest preach, because it's not about the sermon, it's about the harvest supper, this story, isn't it? This is about getting together and eating together, not necessarily about what Jesus said to those thousands of people to make them all gather. Rather, the story becomes about what they need. So Jesus says to Philip, doesn't he, how are we going to feed them? What are we going to do with all these people? How are we going to provide the harvest supper to end all harvest suppers for these thousands of people gathered here? And logical Philip thinks like so many of us would. He does a very quick calculation in his head, doesn't he? He looks around, 5,000 people, and does the maths. And he says, we wouldn't have even with 6 months worth of wages, we wouldn't have enough for these people. What are we going to do? We don't have 6 months of wages to spare. And that's his way of thinking, isn't it? And in many ways, we don't want to criticise that way of thinking. And perhaps many of you tuning in today are instinctively Philip-like. You like the way that we just work something out, come up with a plan quickly, and you're able to deliver the answer to the complicated question. And we need those people, and those people are important in seeing change happen. But what Jesus points out in this story just shows us that when we do that, we miss something. We miss just a little bit of the Jesus moment, don't we? And so we see that here in this story, don't we? Jesus offers an alternative view of what's going on. He says, yeah, all well and good, but what's here already? That's what comes through in the Jesus narrative. Philip is very much, how can we solve the problem? How can I coming in solve this problem? And Jesus rather says, probably there's a solution here already amongst these people. And that's partly why we chose this reading to focus on for our All We Can Harvest Festival this year, is because for me this encapsulates so much of what All We Can is trying to do in the world. We're an international development charity, we're part of a great big sector of organisations seeking to tackle poverty around the world. But I think much of the history of that sector, much of the history of that piece of work trying to end global poverty has thought too much like Philip. has jumped to the conclusion to say, oh, well, there's a problem, let's fix the problem. We can fix the problem. How much money do we need to raise in order to fix the problem? You can almost imagine Philip that evening going off to his fundraising committee and saying, well, we need 6 months' worth of wages to raise funds for the people who are gathered on the grass. And meanwhile, the people carry on starving. I wonder if too often we've jumped to that conclusion. The logical extension of the Philip way of thinking is that if I'm able to think strategically, if I can work out what is needed here, then it must be up to me to provide the answer, to provide the solution, to feed the people. It must be up to me to raise the funds to change the world. And all we can, we just subtly interrogate that assumption that's existed for thousands of years, that somehow it's up to us to save the world. Rather, surely, it's up to God. It's up to Jesus. We place our ordinary gifts into the hands of the extraordinary Master and see what happens. And so, all we can, we consider ourselves to try to ask this question, this Jesus question that he's asking here. What's here already? How do we use what's here already to help provide the solution to this challenge? Who's got some food that they might be willing to share? And then it happens, doesn't it? The boy who's been the illustration of all those Sunday school messages and children's and youth resources over the years, the boy with his little packed lunch that he might just be willing to share. As he places that ordinary packed lunch in the hands of the Master, it becomes extraordinary, and suddenly everyone is fed. So our first challenge, our first reflection for today is as simple as, are we sometimes a little bit too Philip? Do we try and logic it out instead of allowing the way of love and the way of generosity to just happen, and just to facilitate that if we can, to make space for grace? And then the second point is that is then what happens. Some people explain this miracle in the grass, this miracle of the sermon that leads to an abundance of feeding, as a miracle of generosity. Because one moment everybody's calculating and working out that there isn't enough food to go around. And the next moment, one little boy demonstrates what sharing looks like, what generosity looks like. And before we know it, there's an abundance. Maybe part of the miracle of what happens there is that the boy's example shows everybody else that maybe they have got something and maybe they could share it. And before long, there's more than enough to go around. Before long, everybody's fed and there's bits left over. And so today, the invitation is simple. Let's take our ordinary, everyday lives, our walking around, eating and sleeping kind of lives, and lay them before God as an offering. And discover how when we do that, our ordinary becomes, in the hands of the Master, extraordinary. God bless you. Go in peace.